Hello and welcome to Chain Reaction, a podcast series examining America's role in the world. I am your host, Aaron Stein, the Director of Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. Every 2 weeks, we will talk to experts about a variety of topics and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. On today's episode of Chain Reaction, I speak with Dr. Laura Grego, a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Laboratory for Nuclear Security and Policy at MIT, about the recent Russian test of an anti-satellite weapon, what happened, and what the implications are for space and space debris. Enjoy the show. Hello and welcome. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Laura Grego, a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Laboratory for Nuclear Security and Policy at MIT, about a recent Russian anti-satellite weapon test. Laura, it's good to have you on the show.
Thanks for inviting me.
Well, so the reason I wanted to have you on the show was basically to talk through the implications of what happened on November 15th, both for U.S. security and for security more broadly in space and around the world. So perhaps let's just start right there. Tell the listeners what happened on November 15th.
Yeah, so early Monday, the astronauts aboard the International Space Station had to take shelter in their transport vehicle because they got word that dangerous space debris was passing close by. And in the space station, there's a lot of work it takes to keep the astronauts safe and healthy, and anything that might damage the space station or puncture it, they usually have to take shelter. And as it turns out, that debris was from an intentional destruction of a satellite. So Russia intentionally destroyed one of its defunct satellites. And we found later that it was using a direct ascent anti-satellite weapon launched from the ground. And according to the Pentagon, they did not get advance warning of the test. They just did it. So a direct ascent anti-satellite weapon is basically a ground-based, probably shortish, medium-range missile that lofts something up towards a satellite. And the satellites we're talking about are sort of between 400 and 500 kilometers altitude. The one that they destroyed, I think, was at 480. So it lofts a weapon up toward that satellite, and we don't know exactly how they've designed their weapon, but basically the way most people do this type of thing, the people who do it, that they launch what's called a kill vehicle, and it slams into the satellite and it destroys it with the force of impact. And because the speeds in orbit, anything that's a satellite is going really fast, these collisions are catastrophic, and they just they break up the satellite into tons of pieces. Mostly called debris, because they're just bits of trash. So far, the U.S. Space Command has cataloged 1,500 of those, meaning they're big enough to be tracked. But there's almost certainly much more. So there's a lot of stuff that's probably not trackable that are smaller than the trackable size. Trackables are more like softball-sized objects, but even things that are sort of marble sized are off in space, and they're going so fast that they could also create a catastrophic collision if it ran into a satellite, or if it ran into a vulnerable part of a space station that hasn't been reinforced. So this was pretty surprising, not just because they didn't give warning, but because because Russia destroyed a satellite that was massive. So this old satellite, Cosmos, I think it's called Cosmos 1408. Yeah, Cosmos 1408. Yeah. And it was about 2,200 kilograms, which is a big satellite. It's not one of the small ones. It's a hefty one. And so that created a lot of debris. And they chose an altitude that was heavily used by other space users. So between 400 and 500 kilometers, there's at least 600 satellites that pass through that, and among them the space station. So they just created a bunch of dangerous zooming around space debris just in the places where people use space the most. So Russia is not the first country, of course, to do this. There's thankfully, it doesn't happen a lot. It's pretty rare. The last country that intentionally destroyed a satellite in orbit was India, and they did this in what they liked to call sort of a responsible way, meaning that they chose a relatively small satellite at a relatively low altitude. And so the altitude above the Earth, if it's low enough, the little dregs of the atmosphere slow things down by atmospheric drag, and it pulls it out of orbit, and they disappear pretty quickly. But where the altitudes where Russia destroyed the satellite all but guarantees that some of that debris will stay in there for, for years. So it just puts things in danger. And satellites in these orbits journey around the Earth every 90 minutes. So they come back into that place where the debris was created. And stuff that's in space, it's different than your ground-based intuition, where if you break something up and you drop it, you destroy something, the pieces fall to the ground. When you're in orbit, it's this special condition. You're up there, you have to sort of intentionally bring things down, either with a retro rocket, or the atmosphere slows you down and pulls you down. But generally, if something breaks up, those debris pieces will stay up there and be dangerous, and they'll start to evolve and spread into a ring, and then eventually a shell. And these pieces of debris will certainly impact everybody else's use of space.
I mean, well, maybe that's a good place to pick up there. Is Russia's not the first, right? But is the space debris problem as a result maybe of like I guess the sort of ubiquitousness or the ability of everybody to go to low Earth orbit, or at least put things into orbit, combined with these tests, making space debris a global problem that we have to deal with?
Yeah. So space debris is definitely a problem, because, and it's been long recognized to be a problem. I mean, there have been warnings about this for decades. And in fact, one of the big sort of aha moments or light bulb moments about debris was the US test of actually a similar test where it destroyed a satellite called the Solwind back in 1985, which created a bunch of debris. And it was like, okay, so this really could be problematic. But of course, there's lots of space activity. And in fact, it's ramping up because not only big nation states with lots of investments can build exquisite satellites, but smaller university labs and smaller satellites that are cheaper can be launched, and we're definitely seeing a proliferation of stuff in space. So there's been like a big effort to mitigate space debris. That's the regime called space debris mitigation. And it's basically good hygiene. It's like, make sure that you don't, you tighten all your nuts and bolts so that they don't fall off your satellite and go flying away, or, make sure that you have enough fuel at the end of your satellite's lifetime that you can get it up and out of the way of everybody else. You have to use the last little bit in your gas tank to get out of the way. And so everybody shares the responsibility for keeping, sort of the global commons healthy and sustainable. And that's, it's pretty painstaking work, and not every, I'm sure companies are a little bit grumpy about it because they could make a little bit more money rather than using their last gas to get out of the way. They could, sell their services to customers, but people are pretty good about it. And you can see, where debris was sort of growing and growing, that we've been able to sort of bend that curve down. And but one of these big events basically will just destroy all of that sort of painstaking years of effort to eliminate debris. And you could see that happen. That happened when China did a destructive test in 2007, and it almost sort of filled in all of the space of the debris that probably would have been there from business as usual, but we were able to make it go down and sort of filled that back up. So it's and the problem, of course, is going to get worse because so many more satellites are being launched. These enormous broadband constellations are being launched where, in the past, every year we'd get, a few tens of more satellites, and it would grow pretty slowly. But now each year there's hundreds or thousands more satellites. And, on paper, these big constellations will have tens of thousands of satellites. So we've had, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 actively working satellites for years, and things are just like proliferating enormously. So creating debris in that kind of environment is just so much more problematic, because these little pieces that you make may go and destroy another big satellite, and all the little create a bunch of more little pieces, and each of those are going to hit something else, and it can become a self-sustaining cascade, which is really challenging. And for debris, we don't have great solutions. There's no, space is already a vacuum. You can't use a vacuum to clean it up. It is huge. So you can't create some net or anything where you can effectively or efficiently soak up all these tiny little pieces of debris. Basically, you have to fix the problem, you really have to go back and just don't make it. So these things are super problematic, and Russia very well knows these effects. They've known this forever. They're the people who are tasked with calculating the effects of something like this would certainly have known what would happen.
Well, so that sort of brings it to a logical question. It's like, why would they test in such a way? Besides the Chinese test, there was a more recent U.S. test, burnt frost. Was that 2006 or 2004? I can't remember.
2009.
2009. Okay, so I was off by a
factor. 2008. Sorry.
So in 2008 with burnt frost, but it's well known that these tests create debris, and so some countries have moved to close flybys of potential targets, or even just firing at certain points in space so that you can have the computer calculate a successful hit. Any idea why the Russians would move towards an actual intercept at this point, knowing full well that they knew how much debris it would cause?
Yeah, so I to be honest, I'm pretty mystified by the choices they made. Less mystified that they decided to test, certainly mystified about how they executed the test. But so to sort of step back and talk about the technology in general. So this technology, which I don't know exactly how their system is built, but I'm going to assume it's fairly similar to the type of technology the US has developed, that China has developed, that India has developed, which is this direct descent kinetic energy kill system, which is the same technology that you use for mid-course missile defenses of the sort that the US fields. So this technology, this hit to kill technology, has been twinned with anti-satellite weapons and missile defenses for a long time. In fact, so during the anti-ballistic missile treaty days, there was always concern that countries were testing anti-satellite weapons to covertly develop missile defense capabilities. And now it's sort of the other way. Countries are developing missile defense capabilities, which sort of have this inherent anti-satellite capability, but the technologies are so much the same. And so the US and the Soviet Union experimented with these technologies during the Cold War. There was a run-up of a bunch of tests, but they had these self-imposed moratoria back in the 80s. The US's last destructive test, at that point, was in 1985, and the Soviets, their last test of a different system was in 1982. So for a couple of decades, none of this was happening. And it was China's destruction of the Fengyun 1C satellite in 2007 that broke that moratorium and demonstrated this hit to kill technology, which the US had been deploying in the guise of missile defenses. So the next year, 2008, the US followed suit by using a missile defense interceptor to destroy a failed satellite at a very low orbit so that the debris fell out pretty quickly. So that became sort of how you do a responsible test, because there was a lot of pushback when China destroyed the satellite. So India, I think, not wanting to be left behind, it certainly, I think, might have been thinking about the fact that there might be a ban or some kind of constraint on these technologies or tests coming along the pike, and they wanted to get their test in before that happened. That might have been one of the motivations. But in 2019, India used similar technology to destroy a satellite, and in fact, it was so proud of it. It declared that it had joined an elite club of space powers. Like, this is what the big guys do. So after that in 2019, so Russia had been developing this test. Developing this system, the Noodle system, which I think is what they tested. And they tested the interceptors, but had not tested it against a live target. As you mentioned, you can sort of target against a spot in space and figure out how well you can hit that space. But I think for political reasons, maybe not so much technological reasons, but for political reasons, they felt it was important to demonstrate that this system could actually destroy a satellite. They wanted to show that. It's so I will be very interested to learn sometime in the future, who knows when we'll get a view into that, what the decision-making process was for making this choice. It's very provocative. And, Russia has certainly tried to position itself as leading on space security and as a sponsor of its space weapons ban treaty. So, it does not burnish the reputation there at all. So I can't guess, but it certainly to me seems like so Russia has a very strong reaction to US missile defenses, in particular the idea that the US might field space-based interceptors for missile defense. And this is the kind of system you would use to counter a space-based missile defense. And in fact, that may be what it is. It may be just demonstrating, don't bother building this thing that we really dislike because we can counter it. It may be as simple as that.
So maybe the last question, then we'll wrap up here is, as you mentioned earlier, the space debris is a problem, right? And it tends to be a metastasizing problem because of the growing number of satellites that will be launched each year. Is there any sort of potential solution to this problem that would get at the ground-based ASAT issue that could be coming, that recognizes that these large debris creating events are something that should be mitigated or perhaps controlled?
Well, yes, there's an interim step answer to that, and then the big answer. So the interim step is we can just ban these tests. That has been an idea that's been offered and floated for a long time. And in fact, the United Nations General Assembly just voted to establish what they call an open-ended working group on reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors. And that kind of group is meant to come up with norms and rules of the road for space. And this certainly could be one of them. I can certainly imagine it. And I'm part of a group which has been urging them to do just this. We have a proposal for them to say, we will not destroy any satellite on orbit. That seems like a pretty good norm to have. And they certainly could do that. But these are, again, politically binding and not legally enforced norms. But of course, you could lead to that. That could be the building block of that. So that's one approach. And maybe Russia will have said, okay, we did it. We only needed to do it once. We'll agree to that. India has agreed, has done, maybe that will be enough. And maybe we will be able to curb this dangerous trend with negotiated rules. But I think writ large, as I mentioned earlier, these are all tied up. These space weapon, anti-satellite weapons, missile defenses, nuclear weapons, conventional strike weapons are all bound together in kind of complicated ways. And my guess is, rather than addressing each in a silo one by one, they may need to be addressed holistically, which sounds really challenging. But if the issue is we're worried about your missile defenses, so we're going to build all these other things, including, anti-satellite weapons and FOBs and hypersonic glide things, and we're going to make everything more complicated, more dangerous. I think addressing them, the root causes altogether, is probably the only sustainable way to do it. But I certainly think we have, straightforward next steps to call moratoria and call for norms. I think that's actually essential. In the United States, has not been a leader in this. It's really sat back and, basically has taken a lot of shots at the Chinese and Russian, the treaty that they advance and their ideas that they advance, but has not come forward with what the United States thinks is in its security interest. What is our idea for this? And so, so I think maybe this is the time for the US to do that. They are leading on this norm idea. And back in 2015, when there was an international space code of conduct being discussed in the international community. And one of the core principles of that was don't damage or destroy satellites. And I think, the US was prepared to negotiate about that. So I think, we've gone through this once. It may be time, maybe now is the time we'll finally get that agreement, over the finish line. That would be, I guess the silver lining of this very cloudy thing that happened this week.
Well, with that, I want to thank you for coming on and explaining this all to us. Really rich and fascinating discussion. And thank you for coming on. And thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Chain Reaction. Be sure to subscribe to Chain Reaction on iTunes and Spotify, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter at the handle @FPRI. Chain Reaction is a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank in Philadelphia. For more information about this and other initiatives, be sure to visit www.fpri.org.